Painting a Furbonacci Spiral with glassline paints. Let's talk a little bit about materials that I'll be using for the project we're making today. Here's that finished product, and that is that little Furbonacci Spiral. So I'll be taking you through step by step, showing you how to do this start to finish. Set that aside for a moment here. I'm going to be painting on just white glass. This happens to be fusible from Bullseye, but you can use white stained glass too if you're not going to be fusing it directly to anything else. I have sandblasted the surface of this. That gives it a nice tooth so that as I'm painting it has a feel similar to canvas and it's less likely to be wiped away as I'm doing my layers. You can see the back side is still plenty shiny and smooth. So I'm going to be painting on sandblasted glass. I'm going to be painting with glassline paints. So glassline paints are already liquid. You can thin them down a little bit with water, but you don't have to mix medium with them to apply them to your glass. And this stuff seems to be pretty much invincible to time. I bought a set from Third Degree Glass Factory. We found one buried in bins in the back that had been there for 20 some years, and they were solid as little rocks, but I added a little bit of water and broke it apart with a screwdriver and with your basic tungsten pick, and they reconstituted just fine. They didn't seem to lose any color or anything. Another handy thing for the tungsten pick is if they plug up, you can use that pick to punch the hole through the dried paint, and then it comes out perfectly fine. So I'm going to be using the glassline paints. As far as brushes, I have a decent assortment of watercolor brushes. Today I'm really only using two. These are fairly cheap ones from any hobby store. The Princeton art brush in particular is like a $2 brush, and it really does the trick. You're not going to damage your watercolor brushes using them on glass paint because it's just that fine glass powder or pigment suspended in a little bit of binder and water. So easy to clean, not going to hurt your brushes. I'm using a simple sheet of plate glass, float glass, as a palette, and I like painting on glass, or at least mixing my paints on glass, just because I can kind of see what I'm doing. If they dry, at least with glass paints, you can reuse them like watercolors. The only exception to that is if you are doing your final outline, you really want to go back to that wet black or the wet color, just because it tends to go on a little bit smoother than reconstituted from dry. When you're done with a piece entirely, you can always clean that off, but you can keep it and reuse it. And then, of course, the medium and thinner basic tap water. I'm just going to use it to clean my brush so that I can erase bits and to thin down my paints to get them to run a little smoother as I'm painting. Last but not least, your basic towel. Any dingy dish towel will do. It's just nice to be able to clean off your brushes as you go, wipe your hands. Usually a little piece of paper towel is nice for blotting various parts as you go, and you'll see that in the video as we get started. So that's all the materials we'll be using. Let's start painting. So for this Furbonacci Spiral, I'm starting out with a circle of cut glass, already sandblasted, and I'm going to start with just basic black paint to do the outline. This was a bit chunky, so I had to punch it with that little awl to get some to come out. But it doesn't really matter how it comes out because you'll be able to mix it and thin it down with water. Once you've got it thinned to a nice flowing consistency, you can kind of sketch out where you want your image to be. You don't have to be super careful at this stage, just because there's nothing else to mess up, and this medium, glassline paints at least, are a little like working with watercolor that you can erase and not have to worry about messing up the paper. So I can kind of smoosh on the outlines where I think I want my little kitty to be, and then I'll clean it up here in the next step. So I'm just kind of laying it out, figuring out where it should go. And I have sped these videos up, so these are at about 300 times their normal speed, just so we can get through this in, less than an hour. So I'm filling back in some of the spots that I want to be darker. And I'm just taking time to add in little details, kind of perfect where I want stuff to be. One of the things I love most about this medium, as you can see here, is if I decide I want to move a line, I just clean the pigment out of my brush and use the bristles to kind of push the pigment line around. It's a little like using turpentine in an oil painting. You can erase what you've done. If it gets a little too soggy, you could use a paper towel like I just did to kind of sop up some of that extra and then go right back. It's like an ultimate eraser tool. So as I'm adding in my black outline here and kind of plotting out where my critter will be, I'm not being super heavy on detail right now because with this kind of paint, it's very much a layering process. You're going to be able to see most of the layers all the way through, which is why it's important to clean up those outlines before you start your colors. But since it's a transparent color, you can kind of smoosh a lot of color in there and everything's going to come through the longer that you work, the more layers that you add. I'm cleaning up the ear there. And I'm just trying to get the curve of the kitten right. Extend out a paw. You know how it goes. I think you could probably use a fusible medium to mix this, but I haven't really found that I lose a lot of color when I mix it with just water. It's just so easy to clean up. It's so easy to work with. So now I'm starting with a little bit of shadow where I know I want the darker spots to be, and those will come up and through that transparent color when it fires. I'm just going to clean up some of these areas, little area around the front paws, around the back, and some of that fluff, because I'm going to add layers of color in for that. And I like giving these Furbonacci Spiral kittens a big bushy tail, mostly because it covers up all of the leg anatomy and how that's supposed to work when a kitty's curled into a ball on their side. Starting to look more defined here. I'm cleaning up the fur on the back of the little cat and around the tail. So we went from that kind of blurry, smudgy outline to this. And like if you're doing portraits, you can sketch them out like you would a caricature. You can do your lines across the face. So you can see that little finished outline. So now it's time to play with some color. So I went to grab a couple of other yellows that I wanted to play with. I think I'm starting with Sesame, which is a really nice kind of base yellow. Another thing that I had to learn when working with glass paint is because it's transparent, you are going to get echoes of all the color you're using coming through. But some colors will obscure others. Whites and highlights tend to be the best things to put on midway through. Things that you really want to pop go on last because they'll be that very top layer. So I usually start with a neutral middle tone, fill in majority of the space unless I really want it to be bright white, a little like watercolor. So I've started putting a couple of other colors on the palette now. I've got a medium brown, I think it's camel, and a darker brown red, terracotta. So now I'm doing some wet blending. I've still got a lot of water kind of on that paint that's on the surface. So I'm using it as a blending tool for the paint. So I'm kind of just going in and adding some of that darker tone around the outer edge of my little cat figure here. And around the tops of the back legs and the edges of the tail. Just a nice definition. I do think that the texture of the glass when it's been sandblasted really helps because it feels like you're painting on canvas, and I think it helps to hold the layers that have already dried. You can move them. If you work a little too much or get a little too much water on there, you can remove your previous layers, but as long as you're careful, you can get a lot of layers and a lot of color before you have to do any firing. I'm just adding a little bit more darkness here, cleaning up my brush, and then I'm going to start going in with the white to give some highlights on the underbelly first. So I'm going to be adding my fur texture in the red on top. I'm going to go ahead and do my belly now, and little highlights on the cheeks and the end of the tail. So when the paint is wet, it looks a lot darker. When it starts to dry, it becomes much paler than it will end up after it's fired. That firing process, of course, eliminates all of the water and medium binder stuff holding it together, and then you just get that pure glass pigment. That's once it's fired, all that color comes back out. So it doesn't have to be solid, and it will be much brighter than it looks when you're finished. My little highlights with white, adding some spots and dots around the base of the tail and the belly, the cheek and the bottom of the paws. And I'll do another coating of white right at the very end as well. So a good clean, and we are on to that dark terracotta red. So for this, I'm really emphasizing the bridge of the nose, those little kind of stripy patterns that some kitties have on their faces. I'm outlining the edge of the ear, where that pigment tends to be darker. So you can see I've started adding some little hatch marks in to really emphasize the fur. And I'm just going to give a nice stripy pattern down the back, following the curve and keeping it little tiny hatch marks to give it that fuzzy look. You can see some detail here with my tiny paintings. This is all being recorded on a borrowed GoPro, but I like it so much I went ahead and bit the bullet and bought my own. So more of these videos, huzzah! So I'm continuing around the back of the kitty here, just adding emphasis and using that darker tone to really differentiate the color of the cat from that background white. Building up that stripy tail, and I'm going to leave the very end of it that pure white, just a couple little dots and some shadows of the red around it. So that way that tail really looks like it pops. Outline my paws here and give them some stripes. And then I'm adding a little bit more of that red where I really want to punctuate or add a little bit of shadow. I will be using a little more black to add shadow as well. So you can see here's all of that color applied. Next step is to re-emphasize the black lines that I started with. So I did that base drawing, kind of got the idea. Now I'm just kind of doing a really, really thin, fine black outline to really make that color and that creature pop. Good time for dramatic music shift. I like it. So outlined the face, gave a little black nose, the little bit of the muzzle, re-emphasized that little slope of the closed eye. And now I'm working on kind of shading behind the color that I painted for the back fur. So you're not going to go over every line. You're just going to use this to really make that creature pop from the surface. And the black looks really dramatic, but again, as it dries, it'll kind of gray out. And then when it fires, it'll be semi-translucent. So it's like a nice shadow around the beast instead of a really heavy Muka-esque sort of outline. Outlining tiny paws and claws. And then back to that fuzzy outer edge. So really this whole painting was done with 5 colors: the black, the white, and 3 tones of like browns and caramels. And so now I'm just adding a few little dots of black where I want some variation in tone, little speckling on where the whiskers will be. Try and get some very thin paint and commit to those whiskers. The terrifying part about adding black lines directly over all that you've painted at this point is that if you botch it, you can't erase it. You can cover it, but you'll probably still be able to see it. So with this very last layer, it's important to be sure of your actions and to commit. You got to commit to any lines you start to lay down. Adding in a little bit of shading. And then just little final touches, little highlights on places that may have gotten a little too heavy with the black line. And there we go. We are cleaning up the edges just the tiniest bit with, again, that clean brush with just water. But that little Furbonacci spiral is pretty much completed. So one little last view. There we are. Final views are the piece before it's been fired, sitting in the kiln, and after the firing, where you can see those colors have gotten all the brighter. Thanks for watching.